The December wind cut through Birmingham's city centre like a blade, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and memories that Ozzy Osbourne hadn't revisited in over 50 years. He pulled his wool coat tighter as he walked down New Street, the familiar sounds of his hometown washing over him, the rumble of buses, the chatter of shoppers, the distant echo of construction work that seemed to follow every British city through endless cycles of renewal and decay. He hadn't planned this detour. The original schedule had him flying directly from London to Los Angeles after wrapping up a series of business meetings with his UK management team. But something had compelled him to take the train to Birmingham instead, to walk these streets where a dyslexic kid named John Michael Osborne had first discovered that music could transform pain into power, loneliness into connection, and chaos into something resembling art. At 75, Ozzy rarely travelled alone anymore. Sharon usually accompanied him, along with a small entourage of assistants, security personnel, and medical professionals who helped manage the various challenges that came with age and decades of hard living. But today felt different, personal in a way that required solitude, contemplative in a way that demanded no witnesses except the ghosts of his own past. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could show your support with a like. Your encouragement means the world to writers like me and helps stories like this reach more readers. The homeless encampment beneath the railway bridge wasn't something he'd been looking for, but once he spotted it, he couldn't look away. Cardboard shelters reinforced with plastic tarps, shopping carts filled with salvaged belongings, and the unmistakable signs of people trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that stripped away almost everything else. Ozzy had donated millions to various charities over the years, but seeing homelessness up close in his own hometown hit differently, more personal, more immediate, more heartbreaking. He was about to continue walking when he heard it, a voice singing softly, almost whisper quiet, a melody he hadn't heard in decades, but recognized instantly. Sweet Caroline, but not the Neil Diamond version everyone knew. This was the way it had been sung to him by a 17-year-old girl with auburn hair and green eyes who had believed in his musical dreams when he'd barely believed in himself. "Tessa!" he called out, his voice barely audible above the traffic noise. The singing stopped abruptly. From behind a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard boxes and a faded blue tarp, a figure emerged slowly, cautious, wary, ready to flee if necessary. The woman who stood before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant teenager he'd fallen in love with at a Birmingham youth club in 1968, but her eyes were unmistakably the same, intelligent, kind, and still capable of seeing beauty in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. Tessa Murphy looked older than her 73 years, her face weathered by exposure to elements and circumstances that Ozzy could only imagine. Her auburn hair had faded to silver grey, and her clothes were layered for warmth rather than fashion. Multiple sweaters, a worn winter coat that had seen better decades, and boots that were practical rather than pretty. But when she smiled, tentatively at first, then with growing recognition, he saw glimpses of the girl who had once told him that his voice was magic and his dreams were worth pursuing. "Johnny," she said, using the name only his family and oldest friends ever called him. "Is that really you? Or am I finally losing what's left of my mind?" The sound of his childhood nickname in her familiar accent hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, he was 18 again, working dead-end jobs by day and playing dingy clubs by night, dreaming of something bigger while trying to ignore the voice in his head that whispered he'd never amount to anything. Tessa had been the one who'd silenced that voice, at least temporarily, who'd made him believe that a dyslexic kid from Aston could actually make something of himself. "It's really me, Tess," he said, stepping closer but moving slowly, recognizing the defensive posture of someone who'd learned to be careful around unexpected encounters. "What are you doing here? I mean, what happened? How did you—" He gestured helplessly at the encampment, unable to finish the question that seemed too brutal to voice completely. Tessa's laugh held no bitterness, which somehow made it even more heartbreaking. "Life happened, Johnny. Same as it happens to everyone. Just some of us don't have famous rock star careers to cushion the blows." She studied his face, taking in the expensive clothes, the professional haircut, the obvious signs of a life lived with resources and support. You did it, didn't you? Everything you said you were going to do, the records, the concerts, the whole mad dream of yours. Ozzy felt tears threatening, which would have embarrassed him in almost any other circumstance, but standing in front of Tessa, he felt like that vulnerable teenager again, desperate to impress, terrified of judgment, grateful for any sign of approval or acceptance. Some of it worked out, yeah. But Tess, what about you? You were so smart, so talented. You were going to be a teacher, remember? You had that job lined up at the primary school. I was a teacher, Tessa replied, settling back against the bridge support, as if the conversation was going to require all her energy. For 37 years, actually. Loved every minute of it, even the difficult ones. But then, my husband got sick. Cancer. The expensive kind that keeps promising recovery if you just try one more treatment. We spent everything trying to save him, including the house, the pension, the savings we'd built up over 4 decades of marriage. She paused, looking out at the traffic passing by, each car representing lives that continued moving forward, while hers had somehow gotten stuck in a series of increasingly difficult circumstances. After David died, I couldn't keep up with the rent on what was left of my teacher's pension. Applied for council housing, but you know how that waiting list works. Been sleeping rough for about 8 months now, though the folks at the shelter try to help when they can. The matter-of-fact way she described losing everything, her husband, her home, her security, without a trace of self-pity or blame, made Ozzy's chest tighten with admiration and grief. This was the same girl who'd comforted him through his parents' fights, who'd listened to his early songs and offered gentle suggestions that always made them better, who'd kissed him goodbye the night before he left Birmingham to join Black Sabbath with tears in her eyes, but absolute faith that he was destined for something extraordinary. "Tess, you can't stay out here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's December, it's freezing, and you shouldn't have to live like this. Not you, not anyone, but especially not you." "And what exactly do you suggest, Johnny?" she asked, but her tone was curious rather than defensive. "I'm not looking for charity, if that's what you're thinking. I've gotten by this long without handouts, and I'm not about to start taking them from old boyfriends who feel guilty about how their lives turned out compared to mine." The pride in her voice reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Even at 17, Tessa Murphy had possessed an inner strength that had nothing to do with circumstances, and everything to do with character. She'd been the one who'd encouraged him to audition for bands, even when he was convinced he wasn't good enough. She'd been the one who'd saved money from her part-time job at the corner shop to buy him his first decent microphone. She'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, and now she was sleeping rough under a railway bridge while he owned mansions on multiple continents. "This isn't about charity," Ozzy said firmly. "This is about... hell, I don't know what this is about, but it's not charity. You were the first person who ever told me I had talent. You listened to every terrible song I wrote for 2 years and somehow found something encouraging to say about all of them. You made me feel like I was worth something when the rest of the world seemed determined to prove otherwise." He began pacing, the way he always did when his thoughts were moving faster than his ability to articulate them. "Do you know how many times over the years I've wondered what happened to you? I tried to find you a few times, especially after Sharon and I got married. I wanted to thank you for what you did for me, for how you helped me believe in myself when I had no business believing in anything." Tessa watched him pace, and for a moment her expression softened into something that looked almost maternal. "You always did think too much, Johnny. Even as a teenager, you'd get yourself all worked up about things that didn't need to be so complicated. This is complicated, though," he insisted. "Finding you here, like this, it's not right. It's not how things should be." "And how should things be?" she asked gently. "In your version of the world, what happens to retired teachers whose husbands die of expensive cancers?" The question hung in the cold air between them, challenging him to think beyond his immediate emotional response to the situation. Ozzy had spent decades learning to channel his instincts into productive action, in his music, in his business dealings, in his family relationships. But this felt different, more personal and more complex than writing a song or negotiating a contract. "In my version of the world," he said slowly, "people who spend their lives taking care of others get taken care of when they need it. In my version of the world, you'd have a warm place to sleep and enough to eat and medical care when you need it. and maybe even some of the books you always loved to read. Tessa's smile was sad but genuine. That's a lovely version of the world, Johnny. But it's not the world we actually live in, is it? Maybe not, Ozzy admitted. But maybe it could be the world we create for the people we care about. Over the next hour, as shoppers and commuters hurried past them on their way to warmer destinations, Ozzy and Tessa talked with the kind of honesty that seemed to require both the intimacy of shared history and the strange freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. She told him about her teaching career, the children who'd struggled with reading until she found ways to make words exciting rather than intimidating, the satisfaction of watching shy kids discover confidence through classroom plays and poetry readings. She described her marriage to David, a good man who'd worked in the Birmingham City Planning Office, who'd supported her teaching career even when it meant their own plans had to be flexible, who'd fought his cancer diagnosis with humor and grace until the very end. The financial devastation had been gradual, then sudden. First, the mortgage payments to cover treatments not fully covered by the NHS. Then the personal loans to pay for experimental therapies. Finally, the sale of their home to fund a last-ditch effort at treatment that ultimately proved unsuccessful. "I don't regret any of it," she said firmly. "Every extra day I had with David was worth whatever it cost, but I won't pretend it hasn't been difficult since then. The hardest part isn't the cold or the uncertainty about where I'll sleep each night. It's the invisibility. People look right through homeless folks like we're not even there, like we're part of the urban furniture rather than human beings with stories and feelings and dreams that didn't work out the way we'd hoped." Ozzy listened without interrupting, recognizing that she needed to tell her story as much as he needed to hear it. He thought about his own life over the past 50 years, the success, the wealth, the global recognition, but also the struggles with addiction, the family crises, the health scares that had tested his marriage and his resolve. The difference was that he'd had resources to help him weather those storms, people who could provide support when he couldn't support himself. "Tess," he said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about your answer before you give it to me. All right? What would it take? Not charity, not handouts, but what would it actually take to get you back on your feet, to get you housed and stable and able to live with dignity?" She considered the question seriously, staring out at the traffic while she thought. "Honestly, it's not as complicated as you might think. I need first month's rent and deposit for a small flat. Nothing fancy, just clean and warm and safe. I need enough to cover basic expenses while I wait for my pension payments to start coming to a stable address again. Maybe help with getting some proper identification documents replaced since mine was stolen a few months back." She paused, then continued with the careful tone of someone who'd thought through these practicalities many times. "The local council has a program for people in my situation, but there's a waiting list, and they need references and proof of income and all sorts of documentation that's hard to manage when you don't have a permanent address. With the right support, someone to vouch for me, help with the paperwork, I could probably be housed within a few weeks." "And then what?" Ozzy asked. "Once you're housed, what would you want to do?" For the first time since he'd found her, Tessa's face lit up with something approaching excitement. "There's a literacy program at the local library that needs volunteer tutors. Adults who never learn to read properly, immigrants working on their English, elderly folks who want to learn to use computers. It's exactly the kind of teaching I always loved most, working with people who really want to learn, who appreciate every small step forward." She looked directly at him, her green eyes bright with possibility. "I may not have much left, Johnny, but I still know how to help people learn. And there are always people who need help learning." The solution crystallized in Ozzy's mind with the same clarity that had always marked his best creative decisions. This wasn't about charity or guilt or trying to fix the past. This was about recognizing opportunity, for Tessa to rebuild her life with dignity, for him to honor the debt he'd carried for 50 years, and for both of them to create something meaningful from an unexpected reunion. "Right," he said, pulling out his phone. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make some calls, and by tomorrow morning, we're going to have you set up with temporary accommodation while we sort out something permanent. Not a handout," he added quickly, seeing her start to protest. "An investment. You're going to pay me back by teaching people to read and helping them discover that learning can be exciting rather than intimidating." "Johnny," You can't just... Yes, I can, he interrupted gently. I can, and I'm going to, and you're going to let me. Because 50 years ago you believed in a scared kid who thought he was worthless, and now that scared kid is in a position to return the favor. The first call went to his assistant in London, who was accustomed to unusual requests, but seemed momentarily speechless when Ozzy explained that he needed emergency accommodation arranged for a homeless teacher in Birmingham within the next few hours. The second call went to Sharon, who listened to the entire story without interruption, before simply saying, "Do whatever needs to be done, and don't worry about the cost." The third call went to his UK lawyer, who began taking notes on housing programs, benefit applications, and the legal steps required to help someone transition from homelessness to stable housing. By the time Ozzy finished his fourth call, to a Birmingham social services advocate he'd met at a charity event years earlier, Tessa was staring at him with an expression that mixed gratitude, amazement, and something that looked like the old affection they'd shared so many years ago. "You're serious about this," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Deadly serious," he confirmed. "But there's one condition." Tessa raised an eyebrow, suddenly looking more like the sharp-eyed teenager who'd never let him get away with half-formed ideas or lazy thinking. "What's that?" "You have to let me visit sometimes. Once you're settled, once you're volunteering at the library and teaching people to read, I want to hear about it. I want to know about the students you're working with and the progress they're making. I want to stay in touch this time, properly, not just wonder what happened to you for another 50 years. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over, but she was smiling as she wiped them away. "I'd like that, Johnny. I'd like that very much." The temporary accommodation turned out to be a small but comfortable flat above a tea shop in one of Birmingham's older neighborhoods. Not glamorous, but clean, warm and safe, with a landlord who was willing to work with unusual circumstances in exchange for a reliable tenant and prompt rent payments. The social services advocate proved invaluable in navigating the bureaucracy required to restore Tessa's official existence. Replacement identification documents, pension transfers, benefit applications, and all the other administrative tasks that seemed designed to discourage rather than assist people in difficult circumstances. Within 2 weeks, Tessa Murphy was officially housed, financially stable, and ready to begin volunteering at the Birmingham Central Library's Adult Literacy Program. She started with just 2 students, a 30-year-old construction worker who'd never learned to read beyond a primary school level, and a grandmother from Somalia who wanted to help her British-born grandchildren with their homework. But word spread quickly about the patient, encouraging teacher who made learning feel safe rather than shameful, and soon she had a waiting list of adults eager to improve their reading skills. Ozzy kept his promise to stay in touch, calling every few weeks to hear about her students' progress and her own adjustment to stable housing. The conversations became one of the highlights of his month, reminding him of why he'd fallen in love with teaching through Tessa's eyes all those years ago. She had a gift for finding the spark of curiosity in even the most reluctant learners, for helping them discover that education wasn't about judgment, but about possibility. 3 months after their reunion under the railway bridge, Ozzy made an unannounced visit to the library during one of Tessa's tutoring sessions. He sat quietly in the back of the room, watching her work with a shy teenager who'd been struggling with dyslexia, the same learning disability that had made Ozzy's own school years miserable, and convinced him he was stupid rather than simply different. "Reading isn't about being perfect," Tessa was saying to the young man, her voice patient and encouraging. "It's about making connections between words and ideas, about finding meaning even when some of the letters don't cooperate. Some of the most intelligent people I know have brains that process information differently, and that's not a weakness. It's just a different kind of strength." After the session ended, as they walked through Birmingham's city centre together, Ozzy reflected on the strange circularity of their reconnection. "Do you realize what you just did in there? Helped a young man with his reading skills. You did exactly what you did for me 50 years ago," Ozzy said. "You told someone who'd been convinced he was stupid that his brain just works differently, that different can be a strength rather than a weakness. You gave him permission to believe in himself." Tessa stopped walking and looked at him with the same expression she'd worn when he'd played her his first original song, proud, affectionate, and completely unsurprised by his insight. "And look how that worked out the first time. It changed my life," he said simply. "Literally changed the entire trajectory of my life. And now you're doing it again. For other people who need to hear exactly what I needed to hear when I was 18 years old and convinced I was worthless. They continued walking in comfortable silence, two old friends whose lives had taken dramatically different paths, but whose connection had somehow survived decades of separation and vastly different circumstances. The homeless encampment under the railway bridge was still there, still housing people who'd fallen through the cracks of social safety nets, still representing problems too complex for any individual solution. I think about them every day, Tessa said, following his gaze toward the makeshift shelters. The people who are still out there, still struggling with circumstances beyond their control. I was lucky. I had someone who cared enough to intervene, someone with resources who was willing to help. But what about everyone else? It was a question that had been haunting Ozzy since their reunion, a challenge that went far beyond their personal story. What if it wasn't just luck? He asked. What if we could create more opportunities for intervention, more ways for people who have resources to connect with people who need support? The idea that emerged from their conversation was ambitious but simple. A foundation focused on helping homeless individuals transition to stable housing, while simultaneously connecting them with opportunities to use their skills and experience to benefit their communities. Not charity in the traditional sense, but investment in human potential that recognized dignity, capability, and the value of everyone's contributions. Tessa became the Foundation's first program coordinator, developing protocols for identifying individuals who were homeless but had skills and experience that could benefit others once they were stably housed. The literacy program at the Birmingham Library became the model for similar initiatives in other cities, connecting formerly homeless teachers, social workers, counselors, and other professionals with community programs that needed their expertise. Within a year, the Foundation had helped house over 50 individuals in Birmingham alone, with expansion plans for Manchester, Liverpool, and eventually London. Each person who received support was connected with opportunities to contribute their skills to their community, not as a requirement for receiving help, but as a recognition that everyone had something valuable to offer once their basic needs were met. The media attention was inevitable once word spread about Ozzy Osbourne's personal involvement in homelessness advocacy, but both he and Tessa were careful to keep the focus on the broader issues rather than their individual story. In interviews, they emphasized the systemic problems that created homelessness and the systemic solutions that could address it, rather than the dramatic reunion that had started their collaboration. "This isn't about me finding my first girlfriend living rough and deciding to help her," Ozzy explained to a reporter from The Guardian. "This is about recognizing that there are talented, capable people experiencing homelessness in every city in Britain, and that we're wasting their potential by failing to provide the support they need to get back on their feet." Tessa was even more direct in her public statements. Homelessness isn't a character flaw or a personal failing. It's what happens when people face circumstances beyond their control without adequate social support systems. The solution isn't charity, it's investment in human dignity and recognition of everyone's inherent worth. 2 years after their reunion, Ozzy and Tessa stood together at the opening ceremony for Birmingham's first transitional housing complex, specifically designed for formerly homeless professionals. The facility included not just accommodation, but office space for residents to run tutoring programs, counseling services, job training workshops, and other community programs that utilize their skills and experience. "You know what the strangest thing about all this is?" Tessa asked as they watched residents giving tours to local officials and potential donors. "What's that? I spent most of my adult life as a teacher, helping other people discover their potential and achieve their goals. But I never imagined that losing everything I had would lead to the most meaningful work I've ever done." She gestured toward the bustling activity around them. "These people aren't just getting housed, they're getting the chance to rebuild their lives while helping others rebuild theirs. It's like teaching, but with stakes that really matter." Ozzy nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. His own career had been built on connecting with people through music, on creating art that helped others feel less alone in their struggles. But this work felt different, more direct, more immediately impactful, more clearly connected to measurable improvements in people's daily lives. "I keep thinking about that night when I found you under the bridge," he said. "If I'd walked a different route, if I'd been in a hurry to get back to the hotel, if you hadn't been singing that song, none of this would have happened. Maybe, Tessa replied thoughtfully, or maybe something else would have happened that led us to the same place. I don't believe much in fate, but I do believe in recognizing opportunity when it presents itself. You could have walked past that night, or you could have given me money for a hotel room and gone on with your life. Instead, you saw possibility. As the ceremony continued around them, with formerly homeless individuals sharing their stories and current residents explaining the programs they were developing, both Ozzy and Tessa understood that they'd created something larger than either of them had imagined possible. Their personal reunion had become a template for community investment. Their individual story had become a catalyst for systemic change, and their old friendship had evolved into a partnership that was making measurable differences in people's lives. What do you think 17-year-old Tessa would say if she could see all this? Ozzy asked. I think she'd be amazed, Tessa replied with a smile. But I also think she'd probably have some suggestions for how we could do it better. Ozzy laughed, remembering the girl who'd never hesitated to offer gentle criticism of his early songs, who'd helped him understand that creativity improved through collaboration rather than isolation. Some things never change, do they? The best things don't, she agreed. They just get deeper and more meaningful over time. As they watched the celebration continue into the evening, with residents, staff, and community supporters mingling in the common areas that had been designed to foster connection rather than isolation, both of them felt the satisfaction that came from work that mattered. Their story had begun with an accidental reunion and a recognition of need, but it had evolved into something much more significant. Proof that individual compassion could create institutional change, that personal history could inform public service, and that the best response to encountering suffering was not to look away, but to ask what could be done to address its root causes. The homeless encampment under the railway bridge was smaller now, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. Some of its former residents had moved into transitional housing. Others had been connected with services that addressed their specific needs. Still others had been reunited with family members who hadn't known how to help until they received guidance and support. The problems that created homelessness hadn't been solved, but they were being addressed more systematically, more compassionately, and more effectively than they had been before two old friends decided that their unexpected reunion was an opportunity rather than just a coincidence. You know what I learned from all this? Ozzy asked as they prepared to leave the ceremony. What's that? That the best kind of love, whether it's romantic love or friendship or family love, isn't about holding on to the past or trying to recreate what used to be. It's about taking the best parts of what you shared and using them to create something new, something that serves a purpose bigger than just yourselves. Tessa nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. We couldn't go back to being 18 and in love with each other, but we could use what we'd learned in the 50 years since then to help other people who needed what we'd both needed at different points in our lives. As they walked through Birmingham's city centre one more time, past the bridge where they'd found each other again, past the library where Tessa now spent her days helping adults discover the joy of reading, past the housing complex where formerly homeless professionals were rebuilding their lives while serving their community, both of them understood that they'd found their way to exactly where they were supposed to be. Their love story had been brief and belonged to their youth, but their friendship had proven more durable and ultimately more meaningful. They'd both needed different things at different times: encouragement, support, resources, purpose, and they'd found ways to provide those things for each other and for others who needed them. It was perhaps the best possible outcome for two people who'd cared about each other deeply and been shaped by that caring in ways that lasted far beyond the relationship itself. The heart remembers what matters most, and what had mattered most was not the romance they'd shared as teenagers, but the recognition of worth and potential that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. That recognition had survived 5 decades of separation and dramatically different life experiences, and it had become the foundation for work that was creating positive change in other people's lives. Sometimes the most important love stories aren't about staying together, but about carrying the best parts of what you shared into whatever comes next, and using those parts to create something beautiful and meaningful that serves the world rather than just yourselves. Thank you for joining this incredible journey of rediscovered friendship and meaningful action. If this story moved you or reminded you of the power of compassion and second chances, I'd be absolutely thrilled if you could show your support with a like. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more readers who might be inspired to look for their own opportunities to make a difference in someone's life.